Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Power and Energy section webinar on the development of green hydrogen in South Africa. Before we start, a few webinar considerations. Attendees are reminded to ensure the volume is turned up on their device. Ensure you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and audio will run smoothly. Attendees can ask questions via the questions panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. And by default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for webinar organizers and panelists to communicate with each other. Attendees will not be able to chat with each other, however, are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the SAIEE TV channel on YouTube. You will find the registration link in the chat box. Please register, it's free. But this recording of this webinar will be under the Power and Energy section playlist. A certificate of attendance will be issued a few days after this webinar. Due to technical difficulties, our host, Dr. Mataba, is not available tonight, but it is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Ms. Aradhna Pandaram is the Acting Research Group Leader for the Energy Industry Team in the Energy Center of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. She holds a bachelor's degree in electronic engineering from Howard College, UKZN, and a master's degree in electrical engineering in renewable energy from the University of Witwatersrand. She serves as a technical board member of SAIEE South Africa, representing the country in the International C6 Study Committee on Active Distribution Systems and Distributed Energy Resources. She is also registered as a professional engineer with the Engineering Council of South Africa. She is passionate about research in the renewable energy space. Whilst working at Eskom, she has gained immense experience in research, testing and development, especially on renewable energy. That was predominantly centered on embedded generation and its technical, economic, operational and environmental impact. I'll hand you now over to Ms. Pandaram.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can see me and see my screen. Thanks for the introduction. Mix, can you just advise whether you can see my screen?
Yeah, perfect. Please proceed.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to shut down my video just for data purposes, but yeah, and since everyone is going through load shedding. Okay, so yeah, I'm here to talk to you about the development of green hydrogen in South Africa. I'm sure that you might have seen that green hydrogen is becoming a very hot topic in South Africa and globally as well. So yeah, I'm just going to give you some insight into what is happening in the space within South Africa and globally. What are some of the enablers and what are some of the possible challenges that we are supposed to be facing in the future as well. So in terms of just some of the facts, we know that South Africa is actually the 12th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. However, the emissions in terms of the comparative emissions are much lower than other major countries. I then move on to the next point, which actually claims that there would be over 100 million people in Africa exposed to climate change impacts by 2030. And this means that if we do not do anything about climate change and do not have our implement the pathways that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, these 100 million people will be either displaced or have significant impact on their livelihoods. And this is to happen by 2030, which is just around the corner. And that is because Africa actually warms at a rate twice faster than the rest of the world. So, you know, people speak about climate change and they say, oh no, climate change is not an African problem. It's a European problem. I've actually heard this term before. It actually isn't. And because it affects Africa more than it affects the rest of the world, I think we as Africans should be able to have the right pathways in place and start implementing climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation methods in the country and in the continent. So if we look at the Conference of Parties, we know that South Africa has signed on the Paris Agreement. We have also pledged to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and this occurred in various COPs, or Conference of Party events. But if we just look at what happened in the past 2 years, and just going on just a year ago, actually, COP26, we have had the start of what is called a Just Energy Transition Partnership, where various countries and some of the global north has pledged their funding towards our just transition and our just energy transition. And this is then formed the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and this emerges to or relates to that $8.5 billion that you may hear of in terms of, you know, the funding that we're going to be receiving for the just energy transition in the country. And now, if we talk about COP, at the moment, COP27 is going on in Egypt, and this very discussion is actually occurring there in terms of how this 8.5 billion can be spent and what is actually required for South Africa for the just energy transition. So just on Friday last week, we have actually received in some publication in terms of the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan. And this basically maps out the next 5 years in terms of what the energy transition supposed to look like in the country, looking at various technologies and where the funding should be allocated to in terms of the technology developments and implementation of projects. And just to give you an indication, that plan is about 1.5 trillion rand over the 5 years that is envisaged to be spent over that 5-year period. And it mostly involves the decarbonization, so the decommissioning of the coal-fired power stations, and, you know, looking at the electricity sector, most of it from Eskom itself, and then some of the grid expansion that is required. So that is specifically looking at the transmission network that we all know about that needs to be upgraded in the Northern Cape, and also looking at some aspects required for modernizing the grid. This is specifically looking at, you know, the moving away from the networks that don't really have active data centers and smart grids or smart meters, but actually trying to move away to that active distribution grid or some picture of that as well. And then it also includes electric vehicles. So there's quite a huge portion that is actually going to be allocated in the next 5 years to electric vehicles. And lastly, 21.6% of that 1.5 trillion rand is going to be allocated or is allocated to green hydrogen developments in the country. So that is a significant amount of money that would be spent in just, you know, a mere 5 years that is expected. And it just shows you the aspirations towards green hydrogen, just from a country perspective in terms of, you know, our climate change mitigation and adaptation aspects that we are going to be pursuing. So if we move on to look at the global greenhouse gas emissions per sector and why green hydrogen is actually so important in this discussion and why it actually emerged, you just have this picture in terms of, you know, the energy sector, but in terms of the electricity sector, if you just map out the electricity aspects, it's around 40% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and the same can be said towards South Africa because it's around 46% in the electricity sector. But there are now other sectors that need to be decarbonized for us to meet our net zero emission targets that have been set and have been pledged globally, not only in South Africa, but there are various countries that have pledged significant net zero targets, and some, such as EU, have said net zero by 2045 rather than 2050. And this puts a strain in terms of trying to look for the other sectors that can actually be decarbonized. And this is what is mostly referred to as the hard-to-abate sectors. And this is why green hydrogen is playing such a big role in these discussions now, because that is now the golden key to actually decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors. So just a little bit on that, if we look at, so this is almost a map, it's referred to as the power to X. So if you look at the various processes and the various industries that green hydrogen is going to be playing a role in, this basically gives you a holistic picture of what that looks like. So we all know that electrification in terms of electricity sector, renewable energy is always the first and best decarbonization choice. That's the cheapest and most efficient, and we know that for a fact. And as I said, that would account for about 45 or 46% of South African greenhouse gas emissions, and globally a little bit less. But if we look at the other sectors that need to be decarbonized, and specifically looking at the steel industry, the chemicals industry, and the shipping and aviation, this is where green hydrogen actually plays a major role. And you basically have a picture on the slide showing you, the various pathways to actually decarbonize the various industries with green hydrogen. For example, you would also then need carbon capture and direct air capture for specific sectors such as the steel industry and the cement industry, and looking at plastic industry and cosmetics as well. And then in terms of the fertilizer, so I think the main topic around the globe now is green ammonia. And I think in terms of the key or the first success factor, it's actually seen to be green ammonia, because it's one, easy to actually transport and ship to various countries or various regions. And two, it's actually required in the major industry, which is the fertilizer industry. And that's why it's becoming such a huge discussion. The other industry that people are starting to focus on internationally is the aviation or the transport industry. And this specifically looking at making sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable maritime fuel for shipping, and also relating to some rail and transport aspects in that sector as well. So those are just basically where the globe is kind of looking at in terms of demand. And in South Africa, I'll give you a little bit of a picture of what we are trying to do in South Africa. But there are various linkages to other sectors. And as you can see, like if we look at just, the carbon capture, so you can actually capture carbon from the cement industry for production of other green hydrogen products or PTX products. But in terms of the EU, some of their definitions in terms of what a green product is at the end, they may not accept that, and I'll take you through some of that at a later stage as well. But it's just something for us as South Africa to be thinking of, because we are going to have 2 power stations, Kusile and Medupi, going on for the next 50 years, and we definitely would need to think of some carbon capture aspects within those to actually reach our net zero targets. So these are just concepts and ideas that we basically need to wrap our heads around, and also understand, the practicalities around how to get these products made and shipped, etc., etc. The other aspect is, if we are shipping and we are exporting, which is actually the main goal starting now, before 2030 or before 2050, we would also need those ships to actually run on green hydrogen products, or on green fuels. So that is something that is not very easily modified in terms of getting our bunkers in shape and that sort of thing. So those are aspects that that needs to be thought of in determining the holistic feasibility of these various products, programs and projects as well. The costs. So I'm sure you might have heard that there are various types of hydrogen, and we have actually globally being produced, having been producing green hydrogen already. So we have been producing gray hydrogen, and gray hydrogen is actually sourced and made with fossil fuels, and that is the product coming out from a fossil fuel base. And then you get blue hydrogen, and that is actually made with natural gas, but also supported by carbon capture to actually reduce the emissions. So there has been some intervention in the hydrogen space per se to actually look at reducing emissions. And obviously the best, or the most, what can I say, desired solution is green hydrogen, and this produces zero carbon emissions. So that is basically the three major ones. There are quite a few different ones. There's turquoise hydrogen and combinations of hydrogen products as well. The other thing is Sasol has been already in the hydrogen space, and they have been producing gray hydrogen for the longest time. So they have the know-how in terms of how to do it. They just have to basically change the input, which is the renewable generation, to actually make it green hydrogen. And that's where retrofitting and a changing of infrastructure is now required for us to actually transition for green hydrogen requirements of the globe. So this picture just shows you in terms of the pricing for gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, what the current US dollar per kg is. And then it just shows you the decrease that's expected for green hydrogen. That's what's basically highlighted in the slide. And then going to from 2030 to 2050. So you may also hear that there's certain countries that have been quite explicit in terms of what they think their price point should be when they should start actually buying green hydrogen. For example, Japan says, I want to buy green hydrogen at $3 a kg in Japan by 2030. So, it's those bold statements that are being made. Whether they are actually informed is a different story. But in terms of South Africa, we actually have done some pre-feasibility in terms of just looking at the potential export. And at the moment, we are actually saying that if we had to export it to Europe, for example, it would actually be about $7 a kg at the moment. And this is green hydrogen. Now, you must also note that hydrogen itself is not an easy thing to actually transport. So people are actually looking at trying to, as I've mentioned, transport the products that would be made in terms of green iron or green ammonia, as I've indicated, and green ammonia is probably the option that people are going to be selecting the most. And then we also then look at, the renewables levelized cost of electricity in terms of, the current pricing, and then 2030 and then 2050. And this picture may look a little bit different now because these numbers were actually developed or before the Russia-Ukraine war, and that actually makes quite a huge difference because it just automatically increased the demand for green hydrogen, and that's why the economics for such would have changed. And there are quite a few expectations in terms of, the technology developments for making green hydrogen, such as, the electrolysers and how much that would actually cost in the future, and the technology efficiencies around that, making the prices cheaper as well. So that expectation is already there globally. And I think as South Africa, because of the renewables costs and our renewable energy independent power producer procurement program, that makes it a little bit better for us to actually have a good starting point for green hydrogen production. So there are other facts that I just wanted to bring to your attention. In terms of water, so everyone knows that water is required in the process of making green hydrogen. The three pictures that I'm going to be showing you now are from a recent report that Irina had actually published on the geopolitics of hydrogen. And that just basically shows you post the Russian-Ukraine war, what that actually did to the various countries, and how the demand is actually increasing for green hydrogen based on that war and based on the net zero targets. So it gives you a very good picture of the various aspects that need to be considered. The first one is the water consumption in terms of the various sectors, and as you can see that it's indicated that the hydrogen production is still not comparatively small, or is comparatively small to these large water sector or water use sectors such as agriculture, industry, and municipal, etc. And then the other concern around green hydrogen, and I think renewables as a whole, but in terms of this picture, this is specifically looking at the critical materials that's actually required for just the electrolysers and where this can be found. So, there are a lot of advantages, as you can see from South Africa. We have the platinum group metals, and that is actually one of the major strengths that we are actually using in the green hydrogen strategy as a country, because we have so much of it, and comparatively, specifically looking at platinum and iridium on the graph that's shown on the left, on the right. Then moving on, in terms of the last fact that was published in the IRENA report, this is basically looking at the technical potential to actually produce green hydrogen at less than $1.5 a kg by 2050. And obviously, there's various assumptions that are made here. But if you can look at this picture, you can see that sub-Saharan Africa actually has the highest potential globally. And I think this is the key takeaway from this picture. And we already know that based on this, there are a lot of countries in Africa that are actually pursuing green hydrogen at a very rapid pace. Namibia is one of them, Morocco, Kenya as well. And, with South Africa being at the position, it is in Africa, we're also using that as leverage to actually pursue the green hydrogen strategies that have been placed out. But this just shows you in terms of what our potential is to actually produce it at that cost. But remember, producing at that cost is one story, but having to transport it to whoever is our major off-taker, such as Europe, is a different story, and that changes the costs in terms of how much it would be to actually land that product in those specific regions that are requiring it. So the other thing I think people are a little bit aware of, or concerned of in terms of green hydrogen, is the scale and how much of space this actually uses. So if you just look at this picture, this is a gigawatt scale green hydrogen plant. It actually takes up to 10 hectares, just the hydrogen plant itself. So you must know that the renewables is still needing to be built here. And the pipe work is actually about 15 kilometers in this plant. So these scales, and this is just a gigawatt, this is actually small in comparison to what is being spoken of internationally and is required from an export point of view. So it's also something that I think we need to consider practically as a country. And with land issues that we have in the country. Yes, we say that we have a lot of land, but can we actually access the land? And going to ESCOM and trying to understand how long it takes to build these transmission and distribution networks. The landowners are actually the major barriers in the projects, or some of the major barriers in the projects. So this is looking at a much larger scale than that. So it's also something that needs to be considered. And I'm just basically giving you the facts around green hydrogen itself as well. Back home, in terms of the drivers in South Africa specifically, so the major drivers, as I said, is the net zero targets, and basically mainly coming from EU, because they are actually being over ambitious with their net zero targets. As I've mentioned, net zero to 2045, and this was actually pre-Russia-Ukraine war as well. And this targets and the pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions also led to finance activism for fossil fuels. So no commercial banks, no funders are actually funding fossil fuels anymore. So they want to actually see that a specific country is reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. There's another aspect that is coming out quite significantly as well, is that there are partners or export countries that we potentially would export some products to, that will actually start only accepting green products. So meaning that this specific product was made in a green way, not using any fossil fuels, and it has renewables. And if you just think about it, and I'm sure you know, even just looking at Amazon, Amazon said we will not even have an office in South Africa if we don't have renewables to actually buy, to actually make our Amazon products or services green. So there's also that aspect that comes out quite significantly. And then in terms of EU specifically, they actually have formulated what is called the European Green Deal. And in that specific Green Deal, they've actually requested for green hydrogen required for steel and transport. So they've made it quite explicit in that fact. And then they've also moved on to have the 2020 hydrogen strategy, which actually stipulates that they would require at least 40 gigawatts of green hydrogen inside EU and 40 gigawatts of green hydrogen outside EU. So that is significant contributions in terms of capacity that is required. As I've mentioned, Japan as well, they have said that their needs in terms of green hydrogen is 300 kilotons a year at, as I said, $3 a kg from 2030, and then 5 to 10 megatons a year by 2050 at $2 a kg. So they've already been explicit in terms of how much they require and what the prices are. Then as I've mentioned, the invasion of Ukraine and the renewable power in Europe actually having to decrease because, or in terms of availability for making green hydrogen, because of the reduction in the Russian gas. So this just actually increased their aspirations for imports by about 10 megatons a year. And then we know that there's decreasing technology costs expected. Just for green hydrogen production, if we look at the levelized cost of hydrogen, 60% of that cost actually comes from the renewables cost. So the renewables costs are still significantly high in that hydrogen cost. And as we know that the technology for renewables is actually becoming better and the costs are reducing. So that also, just further adds to the business case for green hydrogen. I've also mentioned the Just Energy Transition Partnership and countries investing in South Africa. And this exacerbates the need for green hydrogen, especially in the EU. So if we look at the South African advantages, I think South Africa is seen as a key role player here because we have very good solar and wind resources. We do have availability of a lot of land, as I've mentioned. Then we also have the platinum group metals that are required for the electrolysers as well as fuel cells. So fuel cells are also one of the products that can be made from green hydrogen. And lastly, we have been using the Fischer-Tropsch technology as SASO and we have their existing gray hydrogen processes that they are quite well versed in, and I actually understand, in terms of the production of the fuel that's specifically required, or the technology that's specifically required for sustainable aviation fuel. No other country actually has that experience that we have in terms of that, that's also brought to South Africa. If we just look at the enabling policies, so looking at in terms of, when these documents were actually produced. So we actually did have a hydrogen research, development and innovation strategy that was signed by Parliament in 2007. So we've been talking about hydrogen from 2007. And that laid the foundation for the development of this hydrogen society roadmap. And this is basically the major political driver or political intent for the country. If anyone asks you about green hydrogen in South Africa, you refer them to the hydrogen society roadmap, because that basically it shows you the whole strategy in terms of what we foresee for the country. But they also mention quite a lot of development that has occurred from that 2007 to when the Hydrogen Society Roadmap was actually produced, which was late last year, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have the Just Energy Transition Framework, or it's actually the Just Transition Framework. So the Presidential Climate Commission has actually produced this document. It doesn't necessarily speak of green hydrogen, but it speaks of the pathways that are required for our energy transition and what is required from a just element for these pathways that need to be implemented as well. And emanating from that is, as I've mentioned, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is linked to the Just Transition, or the PCC itself, in terms of, trying to identify where that money that is being not donated, but is being lent to us, where we can actually spend that money. So that is one of the key enabling frameworks for the hydrogen strategy. And then we move on to the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan. So this document is actually out as a draft at the moment. And it basically has various scenarios. I think there's 3 different scenarios. And the one scenario is the scenario required in terms of renewables that's required for the green hydrogen production. So that is explicit in that document. It has not been signed off by all the departments and stakeholders involved yet, but that is in process at the moment. Then moving on to a document that will soon be published. So this is the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy. And this strategy is actually headed by the IDC. As part of their key implementing partner, or their key government partner, which is DTIC. So this document would actually detail quite a lot of specific projects that are going to be forming part of this green hydrogen strategy, but it looks at it from the private sector point of view, and what the private sector actually needs for them to actually pursue for the development of green hydrogen in the country. And it also will include some of the pre-feasibility results for some of the projects that have already gone through the pre-feasibility stage. And it also kind of gives you a holistic view of what South Africa is doing in terms of green hydrogen and all of the products related. And lastly, if you look at the Hydrogen Society roadmap, it's mentioned that one of the key enabling strategies is actually the green transport strategy. And this is specifically looking at, the fuel cells that I've mentioned. You may have seen that there was a mining truck that actually is actually running on green hydrogen. So in the PTX graph that or figure that I previously had shown, in terms of this transport sector, battery electric vehicles are actually more feasible than fuel cell electric vehicles. But when we look at heavy duty transport and heavy duty like trucks and your buses, it may actually make more business sense to move them to fuel cells rather than battery electric vehicles. So there's also an understanding of that needs to emerge, and that would come out once the various feasibility studies have been done for these different projects. And then lastly, I also do want to include that the Northern Cape has just recently also released their Northern Cape Green Hydrogen Strategy. And that they are actually at COP right now speaking about their green hydrogen strategy as well. And it involves one of the major projects that have been mentioned in the Hydrogen Society roadmap, which is the Bukubai project. And that takes me nicely into this slide. So this slide is actually showing us the 4 catalytic, I would say, programs rather than projects for the Hydrogen Society roadmap. And the first one is, it is in no order, but I'm just going to take you through what has been stipulated about each project there. So basically the Bukubai project has been mentioned, and this specific project looks at green hydrogen production and or green ammonia for export as well as local use. So there's this aspect that needs to also be considered in terms of whether we should actually be using it in using green hydrogen in South Africa, or whether we should actually export it. And if you look at, I think the DTIC views and the presidency views, I think it basically indicates that at the moment, export is a better option. And that is mainly because EU and those sort of regions are actually willing to pay that premium. That's what it comes down to. Locally in South Africa, no industry is going to pay that premium for green hydrogen because we are just trying to survive here. So I think that's one of the aspects that have been included even in the commercialization strategy that will be published. That aspect is quite important. But there's some other considerations that need to happen and need to be taken into account there as well. And I'll speak about that at a later stage just now. The next program is the Coal CO2 to X program. And this basically take green hydrogen and the pollutants in the flue gas from power stations, from coal-fired power stations, to make value add products. So this would look at, trying to make green ammonia and trying to service the chemical industry. But again, this would be taking, if I could put it in this way, a dirty carbon source to actually make these products. And that in terms of export will not fly because the EU would want a clean or green carbon source as part of their products as well. Then moving on, there's sustainable aviation fuels, and this specifically looks at green hydrogen and biomass for green fuels or sustainable aviation fuels. And this is to service the local and export market. Here again, as I've mentioned, in terms of the export market, I think the export one is preferred at the moment, and slowly as this becomes cheaper, the local market would then find it more feasible for them to actually use within South Africa. But there are actually quite a few policy and regulation requirements that are coming out for us to actually make more sustainable aviation fuel and reduce our emissions in that way, and especially international flights and, you know, having to refuel in the country here. That's one of the markets that are being targeted as well. And then lastly, there's the hydrogen valley. So this looks at green hydrogen for fuel cells to actually decarbonize the heavy transport industry, as well as some of the industries around the N3. As you can see, the picture that has highlighted the route that I'm talking about. And also looking at if there's a potential to actually look at decarbonization of, you know, the energy use in buildings from a green hydrogen perspective. And lastly, the export of hydrogen is actually included there. So in that specific program, there was actually 16 projects that were identified. And out of that, there was actually a pre-feasibility done on these 16 different projects, and only 9 have been identified to kickstart this hydrogen valley. And this, as I've mentioned, is relating to those sectors there. In terms of other projects and programs that are happening, I think, yeah, there's quite a few things happening everywhere in South Africa, and there's funders from EU especially just throwing money at this concept. So people are taking that opportunity up. So one project is looking at pre-feasibility with IDC already, trying to look at the production of green ammonia at Priska. The next one is actually looking at the production of green steel from ArcelorMittal at Saldanha Bay. And then there's the World Bank project or program that is actually part of the Presidential Climate Commission to actually look at pre-feasibility studies for the sustainable bunker fuel at 4 different South African ports, and the CSR and my team is also supporting this. We're actually having a kickoff for this specific program on Thursday at Cape Town. And yeah, this is looking at the 4 ports. So the first 2 is Boegoebaai and Saldanha Bay, and then Kruger and Richards Bay will then be considered at a later stage. The next one is the Vaal SEZ, the Special Economic Zone. So this is specifically looking at trying to set up a special economic zone for fuel cells in the Vaal, and not only fuel cells, there will be other economic activity happening there as well, but specifically fuel cells have been spoken about, and there's a company called Mitochondria that is actually running the development of this, and they're actually looking at manufacturing the fuel cells in that Vaal SEZ as well, and this is envisaged to start full operation in the next 2 years. And then if we look at KfW, so KfW is part of the German ministry, and they are throwing, as I said, throwing a lot of money at green hydrogen. They are actually indicating that they have about 200 million euros as concessionary financing for any green hydrogen related projects. And then there's the European Investment Bank as well, and they have actually put forward 500 million euros to fund the port upgrades, and this is specifically looking at Transnet and, you know, trying to upgrade the ports and make them ready enough for export when we actually require it. And then in terms of maritime, as I mentioned, maritime fuel, so there's an international maritime organization, and they are actually throwing funding at the maritime fuel or the aviation sustainable fuel industry, and trying to look at pre-feasibility for those, trying to actually look at what they could actually get from a maritime perspective as well. And then Sasol has, huge, significant green hydrogen plans, and Bukubai is actually a Sasol project that is at a Sasol development plant. And their strategy also includes, the phasing out of green hydrogen, apart from the making gray hydrogen, sorry. Apart from making green hydrogen and green hydrogen products for export, they are also considering the future and, the local kind of demand in terms of decarbonizing those sectors. And they are phasing out their current use of gray hydrogen. They have quite good strategies in terms of that for that development. And GIZ is actually funding a lot of aspects relating to green hydrogen. They are also having a program for capacity building, specifically for green hydrogen in terms of, just learning about power to X products, and basically trying to identify, what about green hydrogen that is required from a capacity perspective as well in the country. And not only our country, actually, they are actually funding quite a few other countries. From a research perspective as well, GIZ has put forward funding for what is called the PTX Pathways project. And this is going to mainly be completed by us at the CSIR. And this will be looking at the feasibility of specific projects and specific pathways, and then mapping out, the prioritization strategy in terms of what PTX products we should be going for and when as a country. And then they also have a program that has been set up within GIZ, and this is called the H2SA program. And they have various projects that they've already put out in the market, and some of those projects is actually trying to identify, what are the carbon sources that are available for these hydrogen products that need to be developed. And some of the lighthouse projects that that could actually be the key to unlocking greater potential in the green hydrogen market as well. One of the other aspects that HDSA has funded was actually to look at the policy environment and what recommendations would be required from a policy perspective for green hydrogen, and basically mapping out the whole strategy that I've just explained in terms of trying to get South Africa on the ball on those projects and programs. And these were the major recommendations that were made. So in terms of enabling environment from a policy perspective, there's a recommendation for uniform hydrogen national policy. So as you can see, the hydrogen strategy is almost all over the place. And this is because there are various departments in this kind of landscape, and the department's views and desires are not the same, and they are not linking up to actually give us, an aligned national strategy. So in terms of, what DTIC requires, DMRE may not require that, or presidency wants something else, and they actually have various green hydrogen kind of parties or people who are working on green hydrogen in all of those departments, including DSI. So trying to align that policy and have uniform policy is the major requirement. And then establish a clear leadership from a government point of view in terms of who should lead this strategy, and who should actually be making the decisions. Yes, they can have various stakeholders, but there should be at least one main department that actually leads up this strategy. And then in terms of national and provincial governments and aligning that to green hydrogen. So this is actually a problem in even the renewable space. If we go to local government and, even local government and provincial government alignment in terms of renewables, that's already a problem. So it's the same at the national and provincial level, and then trying to filter down the requirements and policy aspirations from that national level as well, is also required. Facilitate renewable energy capacity growth. So this actually isn't something I touched on very deeply, but in terms of the capacities that we are talking for these specific projects, they are quite significant. And you'll see in my next slide, I speak about 200 gigawatts of renewables. So in the Hydrogen Society Roadmap, the programs that I've mentioned, the 4 programs, they actually equate to about 200 gigawatts of renewables that is required to implement those programs. We have a grid of 44 gigs. And, if we just look at the transmission system that we are upgrading in the Northern Cape, that's going to take us about 10 years to add, I think, 56 gigawatts of capacity. Even that is quite aspirational. If we just look at the REAP, the renewables program, we had about 7 gigs built in 12 years, 15 years. And now we're talking about 56 gigs of transmission network to be built in 10 years. And now if you look at the hydrogen strategy, by 2050, we're going to be building 200 gigs of renewables. So these numbers that are being spoken about, I don't think are actually understood at a practical level. And this is a problem, especially from a technical perspective. Most of you work in the industry, especially in ESCOM. You understand, the issues that come on with just adding renewables and small capacity renewables in comparison to this, to the grid, and what difficulties that actually brings about. So, trying to understand what is required for this growth practically is something that needs to be done. The integrated resource plan is very far off from what is required for green hydrogen. So that needs to be updated, that will be updated. But I think, just understanding that from a practical level is also required in terms of how long this is going to take. We're already speaking about, as I said, the 22% of 1.5 trillion to be spent in 5 years for green hydrogen projects. Yes, most of them are pre-feasibility projects, but some are pilot projects. And the pilot projects that I'm talking about are gigawatt scale projects. It's not megawatt scale projects. And we've only built, not even 500 megawatts of renewables in terms of one plant. So I think the practicalities are still not understood at that level. Then in terms of enabling environment, getting a priority list of projects. I mean, as I've shown you, we are all over the place. We do not know what to strategize on, when to strategize in terms of priority, and what to actually put into place to actually implement that list of projects. So yes, we have strategic, it's called strategic infrastructure projects from an IDC perspective, and they will tell you there's about 80 different projects for green hydrogen that they've already got on their list. And in terms of that, I don't think there's a clear identification of what we should be prioritizing when, based on feasibility, based on the long offtake agreements. Because even though EU is throwing money at these different studies, they have still not yet given us a long offtake agreement. And for us to be able to be developing green hydrogen projects in the country, we need that long offtake agreement to ensure the policy certainty and the cost or the feasibilities of those projects. And then in terms of the market development, they, as I've mentioned, they indicated that we should be focusing on export. And this is merely because the other regions are willing to pay that premium. In South Africa, we will not be willing to pay the premium. So that is just a given there. In terms of earmarking carbon tax for climate mitigation, so this is basically trying to have climate finance discussion, and how do we actually finance the climate mitigation projects? And one of them recommendations is to use carbon tax. However, we still need to change our carbon tax rules because they are very lenient at the moment. So that needs to also change. And then the just transition, they've only indicated two aspects here. And because I'm actually focusing on the just energy transition, that's my responsibility portfolio. I feel that it's not being given the light that it is required. Yes, we're building a TVET program for green hydrogen, but at even a university perspective, I think it's still lacking. There's still a gap there. For instance, if I want to, do my PhD in green hydrogen, it's a little bit difficult for me to find professors or lecturers that have already developed their experience in green hydrogen for me to actually have that in the country. So, it's also that level that needs to be spoken of. And not only that, we have to also focus on the requirements required for renewables. And we already identify our education system is not made for renewables. We still have a lack in terms of, the skills required for renewables. So that is still a problem that we need to actually solve as a country before we start pursuing these projects. And then the mindset shift on the Just Energy Transition Partnership Finance. So I think this was in relation to how much of that money should be going to green hydrogen. Because this was a recommendation for green hydrogen, their recommendation was to just basically to increase the amount that is required for green hydrogen, and based on some of the arguments that have been put forward. So my last slide, and I think I just want to leave you with some of the maybe potential future work and some of the considerations that need to be, taken into account for green hydrogen. I think, as I've mentioned, the just transition for green hydrogen, and this needs to also consider the aspect of energy access. If we are building large gigawatt scale of renewables for green hydrogen export, when people in South Africa do not have energy, does it really make sense? And that's something that I'm actually contesting. Water sustainability, I think, we can speak of desalination, and there may be opportunities for us to actually have some desalination plants in areas that require that water. So there's some arguments that have been made in terms of that, but I think it's still a consideration. As I've mentioned, the skills, that's a huge aspect that needs to be considered. Then looking at local content, and not only the manufacturing local content or the hardware local content, but the integration of SMMEs, of inclusion of females in the sector, those aspects also need to be considered. SMMEs don't even know what green hydrogen is. So how would they even, prepare themselves to actually embed themselves in the value chains that are going to be coming in the country? That's something that, we should be working on. And specifically, I would like to mention that the CSR and my group is actually focusing on an energy industry support program. I'm actually launching that on the 17th of November, and that's specifically looking at renewables at the moment, but it will evolve into the green hydrogen landscape if required when the feasibility proves right. And then in terms of rules for export, so I did touch on this a little bit. EU is actually saying that they will not accept any imports of green hydrogen and green hydrogen products if it's not additional to what is required by the country. So EU has mentioned that. I don't think that is the case for Japan. But they have put in that clause. But in terms of that, I feel if that is the case, then they should be actually helping us with having 100% energy access and reducing load shedding, so that we can actually meet the additionality requirement when we need to export to them. There's also some rules that are actually being made about time of production and time of when it's actually landing in the specific region, specifically EU again. And here I think, ICT needs to play a huge role. data needs to play a huge role, and I think we need to, you know, as I've mentioned, that active distribution systems that we are moving towards, we need to be able to, you know, build ourselves in that and be able to provide services such as that when the time is right. And then green sources of carbon, as I've mentioned, you know, they do not want carbon that's captured from even a cement plant. So we actually, you know, it's a bit of weird concept. It's like the cement plant is 1 kilometer away, and then we have a direct air capture plant that is actually capturing the carbon and says, no, so it's direct air capture. It's not carbon capture from the cement plant, but technically the carbon can actually be captured from the cement plant there. So it's also, you know, those considerations that are being put forward by EU at the moment. The expected price reductions and the assumptions around that, you know, on the electrolysers and that sort of thing. I think if we go to my last point, which is battery storage, but on a different note, you know, we did expect the battery storage to actually reduce in costs extremely, you know, in terms of the steep curve. But that isn't happening the way we envisaged it, and I think that's just something for us to be careful of in terms of, you know, the price reduction assumptions that we're making on the electrolysers, and considering that we actually do not have one pilot plant in the country at the moment. That's also something that you know, we need to be aware of. Manufacturing and economic growth, this is the opportunities. So green hydrogen can actually have a lot of opportunities for the country, and, you know, from an economic growth standpoint. And if we position ourselves properly based on policy certainty and, you know, a good strategy that we all agree on, then we can actually benefit from, you know, manufacturing and trying to pursue other aspects of the value chain as well as a country. And then mining for platinum group metals, I think I've mentioned this. I think also the consideration of the material required for the renewable energy components, in terms of how much of material is actually required. I don't think that is practically understood at a global level. And it is going to become a problem, and, you know, trying to get strategic partners with the countries that actually have the minerals and materials available is something that we need to consider, I think, as a country. Then moving on to costs and, you know, increasing the efficiency. Offshore wind is becoming a little bit of a hot topic as well in terms of providing a better efficiency and also, you know, practicality in terms of at the port. The wind is being generated, you know, not taking up land, etc. So that is also a consideration. I've also mentioned, you know, the 200 gigs of renewables in the 44 gig system with the transmission network upgrades. And then lastly, the energy storage or battery storage that may be required for these plants. So if we cannot connect these projects to the grid, which would probably be quite possible, then the scale of battery storage and energy storage that we would require is, you know, significant, and that also needs to be considered. The cost of that needs to be considered, the environmental impact of that needs to be considered, and the circular economy opportunities maybe that also need to be considered there. In terms of energy storage, like, people are already talking about underground storage that's required for you know, these plants, and that is significant scale, you know, projects. So I think it's just considerations that we need to, you know, take into account when developing our feasibility studies and understanding what we should pursue as a country in terms of green hydrogen. And that is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pandaram. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just like to introduce you. Our host did manage to fix his technical difficulties. I'd just like to introduce you to Dr. Tabelo Mataba, who holds a PhD and MSc in Control Systems from the Imperial College of London, United Kingdom, and a BEng from the National University of Lesotho. He lectured at 3 other universities before joining the University of Johannesburg. He has supervised and published research on energy and electrical engineering and is an active industry consultant with experience in energy efficiency, product development, and management. His main research interest is renewable energy, energy efficiency, optimization, management, control systems, and artificial and computational intelligence. Over to you, Dr. Mataba. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mix. Yeah, so thank you very much to our presenter today for the informative presentation, and it really brings to light some of the important aspects of this green hydrogen. So at this point in time, I would like to encourage the attendees to post their questions in the chat box so that we can have a discussion with our presenter. But just to start off, on the questions, you have indicated in your presentation, for instance, that countries such as Japan would have the prices that they expect from their green hydrogen, the green hydrogen to be at which they expect green hydrogen to be delivered at. So what let me just share my screen as well. So what I would like to find out from you is, is it not a viable option to have some sort of trade scheme like the one that we used to have with carbon credits, whereby South Africa can produce this green hydrogen and also use it within its boundaries, while these other countries where we want to export don't necessarily get the green hydrogen physically, but they trade the certificates. In which sense then we cut the price of transportation? Or what are the developments in that aspect?
I think with that, it becomes a little bit difficult because the countries that we would potentially have these schemes with would be like the EU countries, and well, let's speak about EU first. They won't be able to make anything for their own production, and I don't think we are exporting any products that would reduce their carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in that sense. And that's why green hydrogen is becoming this topic. And that's why they actually want the product to reach the countries and the regions. I think in terms of Japan as well, I think it's their aspirations is relating to hydrogen, and it's because they want to decarbonize these sectors within their industries and their local demands. And the only way they can actually do it is if they receive this additional from wherever or whichever country it is. So I think that may not work because of those aspects. But yeah, I think it's something that can be considered to some extent for some industries. I think that is potentially discussions that could be had. But I don't think the countries or regions are considering it because of the mere scale that we're talking about. Because in terms of the emission reduction that they would get from that 300 kiloton a year, it's quite significant, and I think that's the reason why they are making those bold statements about what they require.
All right. I see that we have a question. So the number of questions which have come up, and then the first one comes from France, who's asking, and it reads: renewables are not constant energy generators, and so battery energy storage needs to be much larger and more predominantly featured. This is not the case in the presentation. He says why.
Okay, and so I haven't actually touched on the energy storage requirements, because if we do actually look at the Hydrogen Society roadmap, they basically speak of firm production, and when they're calculating the requirement for green hydrogen, they oversize the renewable capacity by a significant amount. That's one. Then two, they also make an assumption that these plants will be hybrid plants, which will definitely have to include solar and wind. And even in the IHS market study that was released for South Africa, they actually don't mention energy storage. And I think one of the other assumptions that come out there is because they think they are going to connect to the grid. And when they connect to the grid, this is where the issues of that energy that's being generated at that specific time, not coming from renewables, is now coal. So, you know, the green balancing needs to also then occur. And then that's why the EU is actually being quite strict on this needs to be, you know, have data that's available and the timestamp data that's, you know, showing that this was actually the renewables production, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, it is not coming out as clear, because I think even in the strategies and the projects that are being spoken of, the practicalities are not being considered, in my view. And that's why battery storage is not being spoken of as significantly as possible. In my view, you know, once we get to the actual feasibility of these projects, then I think then maybe a light bulb will come on and people will realize that it cannot be achieved as clearly as they thought it would be.
All right, thank you for that. I think then the next question is from Sabelo Giza. And it says, nice presentation. Have you ever considered the capex value if you are using PGMs as an electrocatalyst? I don't know if this is for a electrolyzer, or are you talking about from a fuel cell perspective? And then it says, okay, it says I'm working on a PhD at UKZN on the development of a cheap catalyst that can be used, that can be commercially used at a commercial viable scale for green hydrogen, and I'm open to collaboration. Okay, I think maybe that's the comment. And then I would say to Sabelo, then I think he can get your details from, I think they are there on the poster and email. You'll be free to email you, and then you can discuss this further.
Sure.
Yeah, and then I see another question which says, will South African standards change to meet the development of green energy, especially on the hydrogen storage? I think maybe in general the question wants to find out what would be the required changes in terms of standards, if they are, that have been identified in order to make this green hydrogen project work.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few standards that need to firstly be put into place, because we don't even have them as you know, it stands at the moment. So just touching on the safety aspect. So part of the GIZ study was to actually look at you know, some of the value chains for maybe export of green hydrogen, and another program. And what requirements from a policy perspective is required there. And one of the major recommendations is that there are some standards that already exist from an international perspective, but we would need to kind of adopt these. And then there are some standards that we would then need to, you know, start from scratch in terms of developing for the various value chains that are required. You know, in terms of just the safety aspect, I think that's one of the major aspects and concerns around hydrogen when you speak of hydrogen. And that was actually the major recommendation there in terms of, you know, trying to adopt those standards. But I think it's still now up to us as a country to determine what we're adopting, what we need to make, you know, put in place, et cetera, et cetera. I think we still even haven't identified whether hydrogen is, you know, a liquid or a gas. And once we actually classify that and understand the classification of that in whichever value chain you're speaking of, then I think it makes it easier for us to identify the rules and regulations around that as well.
All right, thanks for that. And then the next question I'm seeing says, from Ezrom, it says, if you produce hydrogen from biogas, will this be still considered green? And I think maybe it speaks to the general question of how green is green hydrogen.
Yeah. So in terms of when I mentioned the bio input on the PTX slide, that was actually for the capture of the carbon source. It's not necessarily to produce green hydrogen. So there's no plans in place to actually use biogas or bioenergy for the production of green hydrogen. But where bioenergy will become significant is when we need the carbon source. And I think we are still determining whether that is a green carbon source. And remember that that's one of the considerations that I've mentioned in terms of trying to identify what those green carbon sources are actually.
All right. And then I think another potential question which I have, especially regarding the fact that I see a lot of, from a government or policy perspective, we see that politicians tend to want to associate and say we have PGM metals in South Africa, and so it would be technically an advantage. But we also have another political discussion which is going on that in actual fact, what South Africa is doing is exporting raw metals, the raw commodities out of the country, and then so I don't see how do you see this playing, because now it looks like we are exporting the raw commodities and somehow expecting the finished goods, and at the same time we claim we have an advantage. How is this then an advantage for us? Because for me, it doesn't look like these platinum mines are any advantage.
Yeah, I think that's where, the clear direction is required in terms of the strategy. If we are, as a country, saying and putting our foot down to say that we are going to manufacture and we've done, some of the pre-feasibility around that, then we can then say, yes, platinum group metals are an advantage, and that's why, we rather keep the business or the economic growth in the country rather than sending these group metals to China to have them beneficiate it and make the electrolysers and then export it back to us. So I think that is the idea is around trying to develop manufacturing chains within the country, and that's why the VAL SEZ in terms of manufacturing of fuel cells is quite important, because it uses the platinum group metals in the country to service that need here. But I think, again, as I've mentioned, we just need the strategic direction. We need to understand what to prioritize, when to prioritize them, and what to put into place for us to actually meet these goals. Because in terms of just skills, as I've mentioned, trying to understand, yeah, we can mine the platinum group metals, but what do we do then? We don't have someone that can actually design this fuel cell for us, that we may need to buy the IP from somewhere, or that's where the strategy and alignment needs to come into play, and it's not coming in as strongly as possible.
Yeah, I think that's quite an important issue, because having talked with some of the players in this space, or people who are promoting hydrogen, I think what's important for in the context of South Africa is two things currently. We see we are suffering load shedding. We see we have a scourge of unemployment, and these two, I think, they are the most important. And if hydrogen could align to that, I think maybe that would be something which will attract attention, especially to the South African people. But the other issue also, when we look at manufacturing, we see, for example, in the prices of electrolysers, the Chinese are miles ahead in terms of lowering the price of electrolysers, even versus the Europeans. What would you say then would be South Africa, which wants to start off and try and compete in this market? What does it say? Or what does it mean?
I think maybe not miles ahead. I think, well, I had the opportunity to visit ThyssenKrupp in Germany, and they are actually using their electrolyzers that they've used in previous value chains to try and retrofit them for green hydrogen. And then they're making this modular, and they're sticking with their IP that they've created with that, IP that I think they've generated for like 200 years or something. So I would say there is innovation in the country, and I don't want to disregard that. There is opportunity in the country, and I think, you know, keeping or we keep on maybe pushing our South Africans down and saying, no, you know, others can do it better. Same with wind farms, wind turbines. Vestas can do it better. Vestas did from 1973. They have been working on it. But I think with green hydrogen, it's a little bit different because I think everyone has started off almost at the same stage. It's just, you know, the previous knowledge based on different value chains that link up to green hydrogen is the added benefit. The other thing that I think we should also consider is strategic partnerships. I think that's something that the country does not focus on very well. Specifically, even if we just look at solar PV panels, you know, we have assembly line in Art Solar, and they closed down because there was no demand. But now they've reopened, and you know they actually 100% sold for the next few years because the demand is so high that we are actually going to require a lot from international parties. But if we develop more strategic partnerships, I think that would help us as a country. And also, I think there's a model where, you know, you buy the IP initially and you keep using the IP and you try to manufacture using that. And at some stage, you realize how to do it better. And you know that is something that we could consider strategically as a country to also focus on. And I feel like there is opportunity. We mustn't just totally disregard it and say, yeah, but the others are doing it and we're starting off so late. There was already a call from DSI and NRF to look at innovation of electrolysers and you know, HISA infrastructure as part of the Hydrogen Society roadmap is actually looking at development of that, and specifically CSR is part of the chemical value chain for the Hydrogen Society infrastructure that's you know, required from an IP perspective. So there are some strategic work that's already happening. But again, if there's no policy certainty, if there's no certainty of any strategy, then what, you know, what can citizens and companies rely on? They have to rely on something to be able to set them, you know, for their future. So I think that is the main hindrance in this strategy at the moment.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for that. And then I have a question here from Rosemary, and then the question starts. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask realistically, how long do you believe that this hydrogen market can cement itself, especially looking at the difficulties that we have financially to acquire independent power producers? In fact, this is IP, sorry, IPs. I think it might be intellectual property, or yeah, I don't know. So I think the question is, how long do you believe then are we seeing green hydrogen in 10 years, 30 years, 50 years? When is it coming?
If you ask the Northern Cape, they say it's here. So their strategy is very aspirational. As I said, they're in COP27 talking about green hydrogen in the Northern Cape. And there is actually a presidency conference in Cape Town that is actually inviting international partners to speak about green hydrogen from South African perspective on the 28th to the 30th of November. But practically, I think in terms of pilots, people are saying that we are going to have pilots ready by 2026. And that is specifically Bukubai and, you know, some of the other projects that have been mentioned. But in terms of export, I think we are all kind of, you know, getting ready for that 2030 line, for that first batch or first requirement that the countries and regions have put out. But fully operational by 2050, definitely. I don't think that South Africa will let it go that far. So I think, yeah, pilots by maybe 2026, then we learn whatever we need to in 4 years, and then maybe first export by 2030. But again, it still needs to come down to that long offtake agreement, and we need that certainty. There's no doubt about that.
All right. Yeah, I think. Okay, so there is another question. Let me just take another question here. Okay, so it's Ross who says, thank you very much for the answer. So thank you, Ross. On the issue of the grid, if you look at the renewable energy distribution or sources, here we have a big Northern Cape. There's a lot of sun, lots of open spaces. And so the PV, I think, which is why the Northern Cape is so motivated, it sees PV as something that can be used. So in terms of making export projects viable, I suspect then we might need a very strong grid connection towards the coast where the production will be. Or what type of considerations are there? Does it mean that we will have these green hydrogen productions inland, or are they more likely to be towards the coast? And then what does it mean for our grid, the needs for our transmission grid?
So most of the projects that are being mentioned are at the coast because of the export that's required. But there are actually a few projects that will come part of the commercialization strategy that are inland. And I guess, these projects' feasibility may be based on different kind of offtakes and different demands. But I'm yet to see something that shows that local demand before 2030 makes sense, in terms of green hydrogen. I would only assume that export would be most feasible. In terms of the grid, that is not being considered. And that's why I say the practicalities around these large infrastructure projects are not being considered, in my view. And when we do start doing these feasibility studies, that's part of my responsibilities, I'm going to include them. We've already, included those aspects in terms of considerations for some of the World Bank projects that we are going to be doing as well. So in terms of, just looking at the integrity of the grid and Northern Cape, again, it's already constrained, it's embargoed. You cannot add any renewables to that. You can't even add rooftop PV to the Northern Cape network. So that's, I feel, is not coming out. And in Bukubai, I would really like to see the feasibility study for Bukubai, because if they are connected to the grid, they are speaking gigs that need to be connected to the grid. You cannot create the gigs consumption. You're not going to put 100,000 people, millions of people there to create that gigawatt consumption to balance off the use. So long story short, it's not being considered, and it needs to be considered. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. I think I don't see any more questions. Oh, okay. It says very good presentation, crystallizing the gaps. That's from Kelile Mahlangu. Thank you for that. I think that's what also the sentiment that I'm getting from the comments on the comments that I'm receiving here. But in general, as a summary of what we are hearing from you, I will try and say I'm picking up two issues. First of all, green hydrogen, and it is the future. The world is going towards green hydrogen. South Africa needs to take advantage because, one, it has strategic metals, which is producing. Two, it has ample capacity of renewable resources that needs to be tapped. However, we are seeing three big issues, which is the market uncertainty, which is stopping us because we don't see these long-term contracts being signed or being asked for. The second issue is that the issue of grid capacity, it's going to constrain us because if these projects are going to be geared towards export and part of our renewables are inland, this is likely to be one of the second barrier. And then the third option is that currently the markets require additionality. We can't be producing renewables just for green hydrogen if we don't have enough ourselves. So there needs to be, I don't know, like a miraculous ramping up of renewable energy for us to meet this. And these are the top three barriers. Am I right to be summarizing this?
Note that Japan didn't require the additionality requirement.
Okay.
So that is something, yeah, it's scary because then it just pushes our industry to maybe move in that direction without considering what's happening in the country. But Europe does. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the. I think I would like to close it here for the questions, and thank everyone who has supported the presentation by attending, and I hope you have learned a lot like myself. And yeah, we're looking forward to hearing more discussions on how then we are going to be tackling this market, grid, capacity barriers so that we can really push this green hydrogen so that South Africa can be able to take advantage of this.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So Mix, I think we are at the end, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mataba and Ms. Pandaram for joining us today. Really appreciate this. The recording of this webinar, I know that some members might not have been able to listen to the whole presentation. The recording of this webinar will be uploaded on the SAIEE TV channel tomorrow morning. You can find the link to register in the chat box. You will also find in the handout section the October issue of What Now magazine. You can quickly download the PDF copy, as well as the SAIE Training Academy brochure. We offer very lucrative fees to SAIE members to attend and earn your CPD credits. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Have a good night and stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.